There's a process of storing culture because we don't pass culture down through our genes, right? We always need to store it somewhere on some external hard drive or storage mechanism. And that can be the walls of caves. That can be, folios in the library. So storage and access, those are sort of really crucial mechanisms by which culture is preserved and passed down to the next generation. And so from that premise, it's clear that AI is really plugged into that process because you have incredible amounts of culture stored, available digitally.
This is Martin Puchner speaking. Martin's an author and professor at Harvard University. Today, we're talking about culture and what role Gen AI has to play in the future of it. In this episode, we'll examine the idea that Gen AI reflects how humans have always mixed cultures to create something new and unique. My guest today subscribes to this view. Martin is an author and professor at Harvard University, and he argues Gen AI is ancient, not new, and that culture is just a huge recycling project. So what is the future of culture, and what role will Gen AI have to play? I'm super excited to get into this topic and the many questions I have on some of Martin's ideas. I'm Carla Buzasi, CEO of WGSN, the world's leading trend forecasting company, and you're listening to Lives of Tomorrow, the WGSN podcast about how we'll live our lives in the future. Martin, it's a real privilege to have you on my podcast. Let's start with you introducing yourself to our listeners.
Sure, Carla, it's great to be here. I'm Martin Puchner. I teach cultural history. I tend to look in the past for clues about the future. I think that's what I do, and that's what I do in books and OpenAI courses and in MOOCs, in my teaching, in all of my activities.
Gen AI is not a new idea, but one that's centuries old. So give me some sense of how you came to that conclusion in the first place.
Yeah, I think the way I came to that conclusion is whenever there's something new, like AI now, it's an occasion to look back and basically retell our history, sort of looking back and see how did we arrive at this new moment. And so AI, I think, is a good example of that. So it's basically composed of two technologies, base technologies. Writing is one and math is the other. And so AI emerged when math was applied to written language. And so now that we know that, we can look back and see that these technologies have been around for thousands of years, writing and math. And so we can say that that's now the prehistory of AI. And in that sense, we humans have been offloading parts of our mental processes to these two technologies, writing and math. And now they have come together and come to a new fruition.
Can I ask you sort of, I guess, fundamental question on Gen AI? And with that as a backdrop, are you worried about its potential or are you optimistic about its opportunities?
Yeah, ever since it emerged a few years ago, I've been on, like many people, on this emotional roller coaster. So, if you ask me one moment, I'm completely terrified. The next moment, I'm sort of excited. The third moment, I think we're about to enter utopia. So I'm bouncing back and forth. And I think that a lot of people do that. And I've actually been thinking a lot about these very emotional responses and what they mean. So yeah, all over the place.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably on a similar journey, and sometimes that's all in one day and sometimes that's over a month, and you get so excited about what you can see and then slightly depressed about how it might be being used and then excited again because it unleashes I don't think we're alone in our kind of attitude towards this. Okay, so how does culture come into this? So maths, the written word, can Gen AI do to enhance culture? How will culture evolve as a consequence?
Yeah. And here, again, I'm going back into deep history because when I started to think about culture on a kind of fundamental level, I started to think about, okay, how is culture preserved and transmitted from the beginning, starting with cave paintings and in temples and libraries and all these places. And it's clear that there's a process of storing culture because we don't pass culture down through our genes, right? We always need to store it somewhere on some external hard drive or storage mechanism. And that can be the walls of caves. That can be, folios in a library, can be anything you will. And then how do we access that? So storage and access, those are sort of really crucial mechanisms by which culture is preserved and passed down to the next generation. And so from that premise, it's clear that AI is really plugged into that process because you have incredible amounts of culture stored available digitally. There's also some that doesn't make it as easily into the digital sphere. So that's something to think about, but vast amounts. And now AI allows us to retrieve that, to access that, and to recombine that in a super interesting and fast and powerful way. And in some sense, that's what we've always done, storing culture, accessing it, creating mashups. But now we have this new, very powerful tool that's aiding us in that endeavor.
We are having arguments, very public arguments at the moment about how AI is trained, and you have artists, whether that's from sort of the music genre, novelists, all sorts, who are very against their original works being used to train AI. And I completely understand that and appreciate it. Whether they are able to win that argument, who knows? And not putting words in your mouth, your kind of premise here is that this is going to be a way of storing that artistic work, that culture. How do we reconcile those two things? Is there a way of reconciling it?
Yeah, no, it's crucial. And I completely understand, some of my books have also been used to train some of these AI models without compensation. So I completely get that worry. But I would say that it's true that every author has a right to their copyright, their original work. This is why there are copyright protections for a limited time, because authors need to make a living and artists. But at the same time, if you think about how do artists become artists, they are trained like AI on vast amount of culture from the past without which they couldn't have become the artists that they are. So, and this is why copyright protections are very limited in scope. And also these artists are then often creating mashups of earlier work. And they don't want to be sued left and right. Here you took a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it's also copyright protection is what protects artists. But if you push it too far, it also becomes a hindrance to the artistic process. And so I think societies always have had to kind of navigate that. And so in this sense, this is not a new issue. It's just because of the power of AI, but also the worries and the emotional, as we talked about in a second, the fears, the fantasies connected to it, it feels more urgent now than it maybe did 50 years ago.
Just in thinking about culture and this topic, even though technology pushes us forwards, we still as humans do seem fascinated by what's come beforehand. So one of my stepsons turned 15 at the weekend, and all he wanted was vinyl. And if I think to when I was young, my father had loads of vinyl, and then MP3 players came along, RIP, and then the CD came along, and he got rid of all of his vinyl, and it was all about CDs. And then Spotify and streaming services came along, and all the CDs were got rid of. And now you have a new generation sort of rediscovering these old-fashioned ways of accessing culture, and they see a value in it because it is old-fashioned and there's a authenticity to it. So despite this really advanced technology, we still look backwards.
I agree. And it's interesting to think why. I think in part it is that process I mentioned briefly earlier, where something new allows you also to see new things in the past. So it's not, the past isn't static. It returns in interesting ways. For me, I used to work on the history of sort of writing and writing technologies. This is part of my obsession with prehistory of AI now. And I was so struck by two things: that some of the earliest writing in Egypt and Mesopotamia was done on these tablets, sort of handheld tablets. And then these tablets gave way to scrolls and ultimately to books. And now suddenly we have these tablets again. And about 10, 15 years ago, I would see my students sitting cross-legged in lecture on the floor looking hunched over their tablets, and they looked exactly like these representations of Mesopotamian scribes from 5,000 years ago.
You can imagine there's a meme in that somewhere with the kind of two pictures kind of put right next to each other. I saw on your website, you've got chatbots that are allowing users to speak with historical icons, so Shakespeare or someone. Tell me a little bit about that project. That sounds genuinely fascinating. And I'm really intrigued about what your Shakespeare chatbot is saying to your students.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think it was because mentioned I'm not a tech bro, although I'm slowly, inching myself maybe a little bit in that direction to my own surprise. But when this book Culture, which is sort of the smash up theory of culture, it was published 2 years ago, and then people in the tech world sort of recognized it and said, well, this is sort of what AI is seeing. So I found myself sort of on the periphery of a couple of tech conferences and workshops and so on and so forth. And that's where I picked up this possibility that's relatively easy to create these chatbots. And basically what it is, and it goes back to this reactivating these old technologies conversation, that it basically allows you to have conversations with a text or a corpus of text. So you use a text, let's say the Socratic dialogues, and then you create instructions. And what you basically do is you kind of create a historical figure, like a dramatic character, speak as Socrates. Your knowledge is derived from this corpus, quote texts from that corpus. And then you also sort of define a little bit dialogic behavior, which is of course so important to Socrates because he would always ask questions of his interlocutors. And so instead of the 10 bullet point answers that most of these chatbots tend to, spit out, you have to say, ask follow-up questions, vary the length of your answers. And so that's how you sort of craft a persona, but it's all based on a text. So it basically means you have these very difficult texts that I always teach and try to make more vivid to my students. And I understand how hard it is. The language is often old-fashioned and so on and so forth. But with these chatbots, you can now hold a conversation with these ancient texts. And I am convinced that Socrates, for one, who loved conversation and refused to write anything down, would have loved that technology.
Do you think that there's something in the fact that to get the best out of Gen AI, you're going to have to be a creative? Because what you've just talked about there is a really creative use and a creative process. The inputs, the instructions that you're giving are not just give me X or create Y. It's an interaction with the technology. That's quite a nice way of thinking about it. Like all these creatives who are terrified of what's coming. Well, your skills as a creative are going to be more necessary than ever for us to utilize the full potential of this technology.
That's such a brilliant way of putting it. It's so true. And I've been sort of, I think, circling that thought, but you've really put it in a nutshell. It's so true because, everyone talks about prompt engineering. That's basically what you just described is the creative form of prompt engineering. And I'm creating a writing course, an online writing course, where we're also trying to figure out how to use AI, how students should use AI and how they should not use AI in order to learn it. And there too, I hear from this kind of education field, people predicting, and it's sort of a sad thing, but it has a silver lining, that those who have the most education or are most willing to engage and use their creativity will get the most out of it. Whereas those who just say, push the button and do this work for me won't.
It's been interesting. I've, as with all of these things, you've got to educate yourself on it. And so, watch the videos and read, to your point, the YouTube videos and played around. And it's the constant questioning. Okay, I like your answer, but the fact you have to sort of use flattery as well to get the best out of them, I find that very interesting. And so you put it earlier that, it's like a sort of teacher over your shoulder. Well, actually, you need to flatter and cajole and sort of try and extract the best rather than it just be. So that's actually, again, so if we think you're going to have to be creative, you're also going to have to be quite a polite individual. Otherwise, this machine, this maths, this equation is not going to give you what you want.
It's true. You have to be polite, but there's also, it works a little bit the other way around, where I've become very aware how polite and sort of ingratiating often these chatbots are. And that's how much they flatter us. And sometimes that's not helpful when it says, oh yeah, that's so right. Well, actually, no, it's not right. You should have said so. So among my chatbots, the one who is the least polite, because, they pick up the language and tone of the source material, is the Nietzsche chatbot. Will say, no, that's such a shallow way of looking at this. No, you're completely wrong. And I found it so refreshing in a way, because otherwise these chatbots always agree too much with you.
Which is your favorite of your chatbots?
Well, it's, I love all my children the same. But Socrates is my oldest, so that was the first. So, he's probably still my favorite. But as I mentioned, Nietzsche is a more recent one. I've been spending a lot of time with George Eliot. That's been fun too. So, yeah.
That's amazing. Really, really cool. Okay, we're going to come back to the topic in hand in a second, but a few quick fire questions just to try and get to know you a little bit better. If you could travel back in time to any era, which one would you pick and why?
Well, I think Socrates, Athens, and it's just because the amount of intellectual ferment and innovation there was just so amazing. And it all happened sort of out in public in the marketplace. Socrates would walk up to you and chat you up. And I think this is why I find this technology so fascinating, because it sort of allows me to time travel.
Yeah, to live in that time. Amazing. In your world, what equates to a successful day?
It really depends. My days are quite dissimilar from each other. So sometimes I may be reading a long book and being immersed and reading for hours and understanding something that comes out of that intense reading process. Other days it will be, teaching and interacting with students and having that kind of pedagogical interaction. Or, these days, as I'm trying to become a mini tech bro, understanding something about how to build these chatbots or using a new technology after receiving patient instructions from a chatbot. So it varies from day to day in a way.
I need to let you into a secret. If you want to be more of a tech bro, you need to get yourself a Patagonia gilet. That's what's missing in your life at the moment.
Thank you very much. I'll be working with that.
Okay. When you're writing, do you prefer pen and paper or typing?
Absolutely typing. I'm left-handed, and all through primary and middle school and high school too, writing with anything where you smush, the ink around, it's a nightmare. And I also have bad handwriting. So even though I love studying the deep history of writing and manuscript, for me, typing has been a lifesaver, and I love typing, and I don't like handwriting.
If I need to remember something, I need to write it. Like, I have colored crayons.
Beautiful.
I'm in my 40s and I have colored crayons, because that also gives me a sense of satisfaction, and I'm much more likely to remember it. Okay, not at all related to the topic in hand, but just a fun one. You can only have one meal for the rest of time. What are you choosing and why?
I recently discovered this wonderful Chinese restaurant that has this dish I've become addicted to, which is mashed eggplants and these aged Chinese eggs, where these eggs get sort of dark, very earthy, and have this deep taste. So currently I'm addicted to that, and so I'm going to go with that for now. Okay,
that's a fantastic answer. You're not persuading me, but it is a very good answer. Okay, final question. When was the last time you got something wrong?
Constantly. I mean, this morning, as I was trying to work on this chatbot, I got things wrong constantly, and as I mentioned, I was so amazed by the patience of the chatbot. This whole sort of technology, my foray into technology has been a lesson in humility.
Lesson in humility. I love that. Okay, let's jump back into the topic with the lens on the future. So how things are going to evolve and your predictions. So you wrote Culture, the Story of Us, from cave art to K-pop, which meant you had to research extensively, I guess, those direct links from the arts of the past and how they're influencing what's produced today. What was the most astonishing thing you found from your research?
I think the sheer extent of cultural borrowing, in part because the book was written, sort of 3-4 years ago, at a moment when we were very worried about cultural appropriation and whether we should even be interested or use arts from other cultures. And I understand why. There's often a lot of tension and so on and so forth that goes along with it. But when I went into this broad cultural history to really sort of try to distill for myself, what's the driving motor of cultural development? It was really that all these different forms of borrowing and grafting and creating hybrid smash ups. And so it made me realize that in some sense, we've been too worried about cultural appropriation because culture essentially is cultural appropriation, to put it in a nutshell. And so that was for me the sort of takeaway.
All of this is reminding me, actually, two little stories. Not my stories, but I guess things I've read about in the recent past. So one is Ed Sheeran, the pop star, who's been taken to court multiple times with people claiming that he's stolen songs. And his argument has been essentially that there is no complete original song. And so anybody could probably find a couple of notes that were linked or a couple of, tones in his songs that will have come from something else, which I thought was quite a brave way to embark on it. And he will fight these claims as often as they come. And then the other one is around the time of the mob wife hashtag, which was kind of going everywhere. It was a very kind of fashion cultural moment and a sort of very kind of archetypal version of a trend. So a red lip and a kind of dark kind of hair. And I remember at the time someone claiming that it was cultural appropriation if you were taking this and you were Italian, because this was very much an American Italian trend if you looked back to sort of where it came from, and finding it slightly hard. But I could see their point, because it wasn't the mob wives of Italy, the actual mafia or the Italian mafia, had a sort of different version of it to what sort of manifest in America sort of later. And again, there's no question in here, but I do find it quite interesting that concept of everything has been somewhere before, but everything does get moved forwards by the generation or the individual or the culture or the country that then takes that on. And even the food you were just talking about, your new favorite dish, that will be authentic to a point. But if a new chef or a new restaurant has taken it, it will evolve and change in some shape. And wouldn't it be lovely if we were open to that and enthusiastic about it rather than maybe worrying about where it had come from?
Exactly. And, the example you gave is, I love the specificity of it. It's great to insist that this is not just Italian, but then to say, and therefore this is ours and hands off, stay in your lane. That's the part that I don't like. And yes, the other takeaway from that deep history of culture was that we overestimate or overvalue originality way too much. And for me, I became really interested in all these stories where someone encounters the fact that we are all latecomers to culture, right? There's always the sense that most things have already been tried, and there's all this incredible stuff in the past that humans have done and invented, and we have forgotten most of it anyway, and we find it in fragments, and then we sort of recreate it and go from there. So what's much more important, I think, is what you do with what you get from the past, from others, not so much who was there first.
Yeah. You can also use this as a sort of, a business lesson. I read a piece by the founder of one of the kind of probiotic soda drinks. I think it's Poppy. They've just sold Pepsi for gazillions. And the founder was sort of interviewed about the fact that there are now loads of these. There are loads of different sodas that are good for your gut. And she just said, well, this is wonderful. It's great that there are loads of other options now. It's a whole category that we've created, and I welcome that competition. And, I've had some moments when you see other trend forecasters who look at what we do and then just literally copy it wholesale. And I find that very frustrating. And then you have to kind of remember, yeah, but that's good. It pushes us forward. It means we have to be better all the time. So I know we're talking about culture, but there is a sort of like a business angle here as well, which I'm certainly using myself at the moment. Now, I'm going to appropriate something that you've said, which is culture is a huge recycling project. Is that going to change in the future?
It's true that more and more stuff has been getting digitized, from books and manuscripts to images. And, for the longest time, because I also have a foot in the performing arts, we used to say, well, the thing that's not getting digitized the most ephemeral art form is dance. Well, and then TikTok came along and suddenly dance was sort of at the center of that digitization project. So, but there are things that are not available digitally and that fall out of that vast storage system. And so that's interesting to think about what gets digitized and then what gets used for mashup and what falls out of it or what is more difficult to access. And maybe there will be even a premium, back to your, vinyl, that there may be a premium on certain things that are hard to find and hard to locate.
Culture is evolving and technology is enabling that. And it's going to be down to how can we creatively think about it, but probably real life down, we're still going to want something that we can touch and feel because we are still humans.
I agree. And it's interesting that also when I think about, we've been talking about all the cool things that AI can do. I've been thinking in the arts, some of the things it's less good. And so when it comes to text, so images, I would say it's things like imperfection or doubt or saying, wait a minute, I'm actually not sure about that. When have you ever heard a chatbot say that? Or in image creating, leaving blank space. They all tend to fill space up, give answers or spit out 10 bullet points. So that kind of very human quality, Keats talked about Shakespeare's negative capability, like hesitating, withdrawing, not saying something, doubt, error, all of these things.
To close things out, personally, are you more anxious or hopeful about the future?
I tend to be optimistic. I don't really know why, but I just feel when I get despondent, I sort of try to will myself back into optimism because it's the attitude that makes you try things out and get better at cultivating curiosity. If you're too afraid, you're shut down. And I think I can get into that mode too and completely understand it. But so I'm a kind of sort of this commitment to optimism or something like that.
A commitment to optimism. I love that. That's a fantastic mantra to have, especially when you're exploring new technologies. I think a commitment to optimism, what's the best we can get out of this? Martin, thank you so much. It's such a fascinating conversation.
And this has been a wonderful conversation, Carla. It's been clarifying for me. You have a way of putting things in a nutshell. That's great.
Thank you so much, Martin Puchner, author and Harvard professor. Please check out our other podcast, Create Tomorrow, with my amazing colleague, Cassandra Napoli. But thank you all for now. I'll return with a new episode of Lives of Tomorrow in 14 days' time. My name's Carla Buzasi. I'm the CEO of WGSN, and I'll see you next time.